So back in the 90s, point-and-click adventure game competition was fierce. For a very long time, people used to lament, oh, the point-and-click adventure genre is dead. It never truly died, but it was in no way as popular as it used to be. And the game I'm talking about today comes from that time when it really was that popular. You had all kinds of studios leading the charge in the adventure game genre, with the likes of Sierra and LucasArts. And then you had the other studios like Westwood and even Microprose involved. In the midst of all that, and everyone and their mother giving a try at this whole point-and-click adventure game thing, was a series of small British studios like AdventureSoft, Divide by Zero, and the one we're going to talk about today, Revolution Software. Revolution Software came out with a game called Lure of the Temptress, and I played it recently. It was okay. Just okay though. There was a lot of really neat ideas, including the game engine, but some of the execution, not tremendous. But you can forgive them that, because that's the way with most artistic things. Your first attempt at doing anything is probably not going to be your best. Just look at some of my early videos. Ooh. Their second attempt was an improvement in every way, shape and form. Beneath a Steel Sky was set in the post-apocalyptic future of Australia, and like a lot of good adventure games, it starts with a very interesting introduction. In this case, it was a sort of comic book style thing, and that's notable because it was done by Dave Gibbons, who is a famous comic book artist. He collaborated with the team in the design department, and it shows. All the artwork and design in general is top-notch stuff. Great graphics, brilliant backgrounds, nice little comic bits and pieces. It's all done very well. Surprisingly though, despite its comic introduction, it doesn't go for that art style in-game, instead choosing to take the tried and trusted approach that both Sierra and LucasArts designers had been doing. But again, having a quality artist on the team paid off, and the pixel art is excellent. You are Robert Foster, an adopted young man who grew up in the post-apocalyptic Gap. You were raised from a young age by tribal people and learned how to survive out there, while picking up a whole pile of other interesting skills like mechanical engineering, which helped you build a robot pal called Joey. And then people come out looking for you and decide to kill all your adoptive family. This doesn't sit well with you, and the helicopter carrying you back to Union City is downed. You escape the crash, and you're wanted for some reason and chased after, and become a fugitive in the upper echelons of this sprawling cityscape. So that's 2 crashes you've been involved in your lifetime. I guess you really don't have much luck with transportation, do you? So you have these authorities pursuing you, you have an identity that you stole off one of their corpses, and now you have to figure out how on earth you are going to get down from the topmost part of the city to the bottom and eventually escape. All the while figuring out what on earth is going on, who you are and where you originally came from, and just what Link is and what it stands for. You start off in this industrial area with nothing but your good looks and a trench coat and Joey's circuit board, and you're thinking, hey, lots of machinery and post-apocalyptic world and dystopian science fiction future, this is going to be a dark and gritty narrative. And you'd be wrong. You have an inventory bar at the top that you mouse over, and the mouse controls are a bit strange. You left-click to look at things, and right-click to interact with them. Except people. Left-click seems to cause you to interact with them as well. And the game sets itself up quite nicely, because if you wander down despite Robert's protestations, you'll just get shot and die. This is different from a lot of adventure games which would not kill you no matter how stupid you were. There were 2 different schools of thought on the matter. Either have an open adventure game that you can't technically fail, or have a more Sierra-style adventure game where you can fail without realizing, or constantly die if you make the wrong mistakes. To be fair to Beneath a Steel Sky, you don't die all the time. It's only if you do something really stupid usually. And now we get to the music, which is okay, but it can get a bit annoying. Why is that? Because it loops a lot. There's a bit that's nicely composed for the most part, and then it repeats itself, and repeats itself, and repeats itself, to the point where when you finally reach a new area, you let out a sigh of relief. You're like, oh, thank goodness, a new musical bit. Likewise, if you enter a new room and the same piece of music starts playing again, you're like, I can't escape this. It's your standard inventory-based puzzle game with point-and-click interface. But I found when activating the inventory, it had a tendency to pause the game completely. People had their day-to-day routines. You couldn't just go back to the same place and expect the person to be there. There was one character called Lamb who just took a lift and went off to his apartment and chilled there for a while. And I was like, where's he gone? I need him! Come back! This is because it uses the same virtual theater engine as the previous game. And that comes with some drawbacks as well. In addition to the NPCs wandering about from time to time if they're coded that way, they also have specific places they need to stand in order to initiate conversation with you. And because the NPCs actually have collision detection, if something is in the way of initiating that conversation, like a robot pal, then it just cancels out. Likewise, if you're solving puzzles and you happen to get in the way of your robot pal or vice versa, it just doesn't work. To be fair to the game, sometimes it'll tell you why things have gone wrong, but other times it'll just not function, and you'll just be sat there, waiting for something to happen, and it doesn't. Speaking of things that sometimes get in the way of the engine, there's Joey. Joey is your robotic pal. He's a circuit board that you insert into other robots. He takes control of them and follows you around and helps doing various tasks for you. He's about as optimistic as Marvin the paranoid android, but rather than being completely depressive, he tends to take it out on poor old Foster. And it's one of the essential parts of a good point-and-click adventure game, having that back and forth repartee. And Joey's funny, he's really entertaining. You'll definitely want to get his opinion and views on things as the game progresses. This also means every time you come across a new robot, you can be like, hey, a new shell for Joey, and you can tell him as much as well. Unfortunately, in order to get at the robot, there's usually a puzzle involved, and once Joey's in the new shell, he can usually help you with other scenarios that you can't quite figure out. The problem is that some of these puzzles require Joey and others don't, so you can never be entirely certain if you're just not figuring out a puzzle right, or whether you need Joey in some new shell in order to fix the puzzle. You make your way through several of these puzzles, one of the early ones being time sensitive, which was a bit annoying, because you were fighting the engine and its mechanics in order to pick up the item. And throughout this, there's jaunty music going on, and you talk to this engineer fella, and you suddenly realise that this isn't going to be some gritty, dark thriller of a post-apocalyptic game, but more of a sort of standard, comedic point-and-click adventure. The problem with having a good sense of humour is that it needs to be at the appropriate time, and with Beneath a Steel Sky, there is tonal whiplash, which means that 1 minute you can go from a dramatic situation that is quite gruesome and bloody and definitely adult, and then you end up in a humorous circumstance where they're just making fun of the life and death situation that had previously befallen them. Something feels off about the way in which it has been utilised in Beneath a Steel Sky. And I think that has actually been documented. The two writers wanted to go in different directions. And when you have two people pulling one way and the other, sometimes it can result in something brilliant. And then other times, stuff like this happens. where whatever's being said just feels a little bit out of place. The humor's good though, I really enjoyed it. There was one bit where you had Joey navigate you into this warehouse, and you proceeded to do the point-and-click adventure thing where you picked up everything that wasn't glued down. You exit the warehouse thinking, yeah, I've got a whole pile of new items here that I can use on all kinds of puzzles. And then this interfering busybody of a staff member comes up to you and basically states, what are you doing? Why have you gone into that warehouse and stolen all these things? And he proceeds to confiscate them all. It's a nice little breaking of the fourth wall, because the game knows that if you've played point-and-click adventure games before, that you'll be wanting to take as many things as you can. Every so often you'll come across what's called a link terminal. This leads to another section of the game where you essentially press a few buttons and interact with the computer terminal. These terminals are operated by inserting your ID card into them. Your ID card, which you stole from one of the security people that died in a crash, is exceedingly useful. You can't go anywhere without an ID card, so upgrading it at link terminals and getting extra permissions is essential. Plus, the link terminals themselves have bits of flavor text that immerse you in the world a bit more, and that is really important in a narrative-heavy game. Eventually, you make it down to the lower levels, and as befits a stratified city of class, as you get lower and closer to the bottom, things look prettier. The only lingering sense that you're in a post-apocalyptic world is the totalitarian government that seems to be in control of everything, which is another mystery that you eventually start to unfold. Eventually you start to realize that every character you meet and talk to is quirky. Now, this is par for the course for a lot of adventure games, but here, they're not all that interesting, most of them. They just don't feel as memorable as certain other encounters, which is actually more realistic because, yes, in real life you'll come across some people that are as dry as staring at a bit of cardboard with paint slowly drying on it. That's a terrible analogy, why did I think of that? But yes, not everybody in real life is going to be really, really interesting or eccentric, and some of the people that are quirky and eccentric are only superficially so and are kind of a drag after a while. And the same applies in the game. The keen-eyed among you who use subtitles will also note that some of the written dialogue is different from what's actually spoken. This is because the team decided to re-record some of the dialogue in the game, because they weren't happy with the original voice acting. Another thing that doesn't really make much sense is some random capitalization going on. I'm not entirely sure what that has to do with the game in general. I remember in some of the older text parser games and RPG games with text-based conversation systems, you had capitalized words that would link you to future topics that you could type out, but that doesn't appear to be the case here. The meat and potatoes of an adventure game other than its characters are its puzzles, and in Beneath a Steel Sky, there isn't a great degree of moon logic. I mean, there's no ridiculous puzzles until towards the very end, but the puzzles, they're not as great as some of the classics of the genre. They're a little finicky, some of them require timing, some of them just don't seem to be quite as logical as they could be, and others are just plain annoying. I was able to get through most of it using the old grey matter, but towards the final third of the game, I consulted an FAQ. The last notable thing that I want to talk about is Linkspace. Linkspace is this virtual reality cyberspace thing that's very cyberpunk. You enter this graphical representation of cyberspace and use inventory items to unlock computer systems using a digital avatar. And it's really cool. It's an excellent utilization of the same mechanics as the point-and-click adventure game with a difference in art style and presentation. It's a shame really that it's not used that much within the game. I feel if they'd expanded upon it a bit more and maybe made it a little more friendly to the user, then it could have really been something special. As it stands, it's just a minor curiosity, and it'll make you go, oh, that's cool. That's a nice little addition. Oh, it's done. Okay. People call Beneath a Steel Sky a classic, and I guess it is, but in no way is it as good as some of the other point-and-click adventure games out there. I think they call it classic because it was released in 1994, around the heyday of the point-and-click adventure in general. And to be fair to it, compared to most point-and-click adventure games out there, it is good. When compared to the heights that Sierra and LucasArts scaled at the time, it falls that little bit short. And it's also living in the shadow of the next adventure game that Revolution Software would release, the Broken Sword series that they've been making bank on ever since. So if you're looking for a point-and-click adventure game that isn't by the big two, then this is one of them. It's really good in that respect. So long as you don't go in there expecting it to be just as good as LucasArts or Sierra, then yeah, you'll probably have a good time with this. You might also note that I haven't talked about the plot all that much, because I don't want to spoil it, and that's because this game has been freeware since 2003. Anyone can download and play it, and I would encourage you to do so. Anyone can fire up ScumVM, stick Beneath a Steel Sky in there, and have a great time. So instead of delving further into the plot and talking about the dynamics of the link system and its control over the city and the setting and all the characters by name, I'll just tell you to go play it. It's worth a play. Do so.